Among the responsibilities that Jesus fulfilled while he was on the earth was he had a threefold ministry. Generally, if you project forward from the Old Testament, you see that he was a prophet, he was a priest, and a king. He had a priestly role. Why would it be necessary for us to have a priest? It's kind of interesting. We don't think in those terms very often because we are very, very far removed from what the Israelites were familiar with. And we've discussed this on Wednesday night, so I won't go into a lot of detail of that, but just the portion we're going through in the book of Hebrews, you realize that the tabernacle was in the center of the camp. They encamped completely around it, and the duration of the day, every day, was the priest offering sacrifice for himself and then sacrifice on behalf of the people. So, and all of the blood, all of the sacrifices, that which was taken outside the camp, which was just on the other side of the encampment, basically. So, in essence, you're in a wilderness, a very warm environment, and you have an open-air slaughterhouse almost continually. That picture and that focus was that it was a daily thing. They opened up the flap of their tent. That's what they saw. They would see the smoke rising from the sacrifice day after day after day, all day long. Why do we need a priest? And by the way, the answer is not that different from why they needed a priest.
In my mind, God is a God of order, and in the order of the Godhead and details of life, a priest is a leadership. It's like Ken Ford in Alton Bible. And when Jesus talks about the body having various parts, there's God being a God of order. There's various parts and roles that individuals play within the concept of our Christian relationship with Jesus Christ.
Except the New Testament church, we're all priests.
That's right.
So, why do we need an intercessor? Why do we need one to intercede?
Well, you just said it, Pastor, because God is holy. We are sinful. We need somebody. We are not able to be in God's presence because of this sin that's in us. So Jesus Christ makes intercession for us to his Father. And every time God looks at us, he sees the face of his Son, Jesus Christ.
That was the foundational basis of the Old Testament tabernacle setting, was so that God could dwell in the midst of his people. So holy God could dwell with his people, his sinful people. But you made a similar comparison to us, and you said it just like, you realize there's a lot of people in our world today that absolutely ignore any sense of the idea that we might need an intercessor because we are so unholy compared to God. A lot of people don't like that idea. And if you bring up the duty of Christ as a priest and the realization that we need a priest, they don't like that. Because that implies that we're a broken mess. Yeah. That's absolutely contrary to the modern trends of human irresponsibility. Nobody's responsible for anything. Nobody has to claim responsibility for anything anymore. He offered himself for us. There were two aspects in particular of his priestly duty. One was satisfaction. That is, to provide sanctification, he had to satisfy the demands of the Father. The sacrifice had to be sufficient in that regard. The other is, of course, intercession, where he intercedes for us. Where would we be without that? We'd be doomed to hell. That's the simple way to put it. Absolutely accurate way to put it. We would be doomed to hell with no hope whatsoever. He served as our priest, and we have an intercessor.
There would actually be a reason why people would be afraid to die.
There are people that aren't afraid to die that should be, because they believe a lie. The enemy's really good at that. But there are, of course, many of us who, in our own right, ought to be afraid, but have no reason to be, because of Christ. Because of Christ. Going to break for class or not? Okay. All right. Then we will pick up in our study, and we'll go to Luke 7 this morning. We'll start there, and then we'll jump to Matthew's Gospel. So how far we get through some of the events of the life of Christ. And we don't have a day-by-day itinerary. So sometimes we don't know if there was a couple-week gap between some of the events that Christ did that are recorded here, or if some of them happen one right after the next, after the next, after the next. We know that there was the man that was demon-possessed. He was mute. And Christ healed him. There was a outcry about that because they said the only way he did that was through the demons themselves and Satan. And Jesus goes across the sea, and when he gets across, he is immediately met with a couple demon-possessed that he drives the demons out of them into the swine, and they go off a cliff, and we know those certain events like that happen in close procession, one after the next, but we don't always have all of those details. But you can see how one event after another, from the feeding of the 5,000 to the massive crowds to all the people that are sick, that are healed, to word spreading rapidly. I mean, without modern communication like we have, the entire region was buzzing with what was going on. Luke chapter 7, and we pick up verse 11, we find not your normal daily event. You would think that if you were going to report the news, the evening news on this night, that this would probably make it. You know, in fact, it probably would make breaking news as soon as they got word of it. Soon afterward, so we have close proximity of details. You have chronologically these things taking place. He just healed the centurion's son. or servant rather, and we know also that he goes to a different town, now to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. So he's gaining a crowd as he progresses. The disciples were there. He drew near to the gate of the town, and behold, the man who had died was being carried out. Oh, if he'd have been there just a little sooner, right? If he just wouldn't have got distracted with that Gentile Roman centurion and his servant, maybe he'd have got here in time. But he drew near the gate. The old man who died was being carried out, the only son of his mother. She was a widow. A considerable crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion, said, "Don't weep." Then he came up and touched her, and the bearers stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." We'll stop there for now. That's an interesting thing to say. So, in the chronological time frame here, Jesus proceeds to the town, and as he gets there, he's immediately met with a funeral procession, and presents an incredibly difficult situation in the culture. A wife was dependent on her husband for care. He was gone, and in his absence, then she would be dependent upon her children, predominantly sons. She only had one, and this one and only son is now deceased. That's a significantly difficult situation for her. It's not an easy circumstance in our culture. We do have other means by which one can be cared for, but in some cultures, Middle East cultures, it goes even deeper than that. Example, in India, we encountered a young lady wandering the street in the middle of the day. The hot sun, appeared dazed. And we had a gal from ministry team with us, so we were able to pick this gal up in the vehicle that we had and attend to her needs. Discovered that she was, for whatever reason, her husband had beaten her and kicked her out. And in that culture, she would be shunned by, and no one would take care of her. No one would take care of it, because if she was cast out for whatever reason, he just, was ordinary that day and decided to throw her out, no one else would step up, and there's a cultural thing there. And thankfully we were able to take care of her immediate needs and get her to safety, and then find a relative that if we could get her on a train and get her there, they would at least give her a safe place to stay, which was unique, because most, once one family member casts them out, nobody, not even her family, because at that point, her family would not take her back, because they'd given her away in marriage. They're not taking her back. we don't generally think in those terms in our culture. So you understand, this is a very difficult situation.
We know there was ladies that took care of themselves in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But this young woman, the culture says they can't take care of themselves.
Definitely much more difficult than I think we could fathom. It was a very difficult situation. Add to, I mean, take an individual in that setting. Consider an agrarian society. Right? Jack's here, so we can talk about Jack, right? How many times do kids, grandkids lend a hand on the farm? We've seen it all around us over the years. You know? Not in recent years. There were years after I started here where I'd be spending part of a Saturday or maybe part of a weekday helping throw hay in a barn. Why? Because when the hay comes in, it's not a one-person job. It takes a crew, you know. And what do you do if you're by yourself? It's a difficult thing. And the text says Jesus had compassion on her. Well, we wouldn't expect any different. He had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." That sounds contrary to compassion. It seems like you ought to be able to say, if you're expressing compassion, that you recognize the difficulty of the situation. We rejoice with those who rejoice, and we weep with those who weep. It seems like a time that you may want to be the strong one in the room, but your emotions will share the fact that you recognize the difficulty of the situation, and you would show that. Jesus says, don't weep. It was common as the funeral procession went. Culturally, it was different than what we're used to here. It's not uncommon for us to have a funeral here where they are buried next door, and so we have a procession from here over, and we walk behind the hearse, and it's pretty quiet. Might be a little chatter, but generally pretty quiet. Their processions would have been loud wailing. And the wailing of the crowd would have demonstrated at least an expression of encouragement, if you will, or recognition for this woman. And Jesus says, don't weep. By the way, it's not as cold sounding as if someone just said, hey, get over it. Life happens. It's not it at all. Jesus had a plan that they had no comprehension of. He saw her, he had compassion, he said, don't weep. Then he did the absolute unthinkable. If that wasn't culturally insensitive enough or appearing to be, then Jesus walks up and he touches the casket. You don't do that. We do. It's not uncommon for someone to walk up and their hands on the casket and lean on it. We don't think the same way that they do. No Jewish person would attempt that. They wouldn't risk touching the dead, because to do so you would become unclean, ceremonially unclean. You don't do that. He came up and touched it, and the pallbearers stopped. They stood still. They're trying to figure out what's going on. Nobody would do that. Nobody would do that. But Jesus does. And then he goes a step further. He speaks to the deceased. Now again, at this point, that's not absolutely uncommon. I've seen a lot of funerals where a loved one, a friend, would lean over casket and express some level of emotion, some words, maybe how much they're going to miss them, or not that they could hear them, but wish them well, or those sorts of things. All the funerals that I've done, I've not yet had anyone walk up and say, "Would you just get up?" I'm not sure what I would do. But if I were standing there and somebody said that and the person actually got up, you see what's happening here? Jesus interrupts a funeral procession, tells the grieving widow mother to not weep. Comes up, he's not afraid of the dead. And he speaks to him and says, "Arise, get up." That's a bizarre thing to say to someone in that situation. What's far more bizarre in our mind is that I like how Luke says this. Notice the words in verse 15. Understand who's right. Who's right? Luke's writing it. What did Luke do for a profession? He was a physician. He was a physician. He doesn't give you a clouded tale here. This isn't a news commentary. This is a physician giving us a clear description of what actually takes place. And look at it carefully. The dead man, he doesn't say, well, man must not have been as bad off as we thought. You know, he must have been maybe comatose, maybe just slightly unconscious, or no. We're not given that. He knows. The assessment is clear. The dead man sat up and began to speak. That is a really incredible verse, isn't it? Just look at what it says. The dead man sat up and began to speak. I don't know. What do you think he said? What am I doing in this box? Why'd you put me here? Why is everybody crying? What's going on? Or can you let me down? He sits up and begins to speak. This is one of 3 recorded times that Jesus restored life to someone who had died, that we know of. John tells us he did far more than what's recorded. There's just not room to record all of it, so we don't know the full extent. But we have 3 recorded accounts of that. I don't know about you, but if I was in that culture, in that mindset, and afraid to even approach, lest I become ceremonially unclean, and the dead man sits up and begins to speak, I think I'd be terrified. So do you reach a hand out and touch the dead man who's not dead now? Is it okay to touch him now to help him out? I mean, Luke doesn't give us all those details, but he does give us this absolute specific. The diagnosis is clear. The man was dead. Now he isn't. God gave him life. Dead man sat up, began to speak. Jesus gave him, or presented him, to his mother. Fear seized them all. You think?
Pastor, in why, instead of fear, why did they not feel joy? Joy for the compassion that Jesus Christ showed to the mother, and joy that the mother now has her son back.
Right. Yes. Right. From our safe distance, that's what we think they should do. The morning's over. It's time to celebrate. Until you put yourself in that spot and realize that doesn't happen. Said, I've done a lot of funerals, and no one's sat up in the casket, started talking, and come back to life. Hasn't happened. I don't know any of the funeral directors that I've worked with that have had that experience. Television, if they portray somebody coming up on a body that they assume is deceased, and then there's movement or speech, they freak out and take off running. What would we do, really? I mean, understanding sit tight. We're good for a few hours now. Jesus walks up, speaks to the dead man, and says, "Arise." He sits up and begins to talk. They did not all grasp the entirety of what they had seen in front of them. But there had to be a recognition that Jesus was completely out of their league. He had done something. They didn't have a clue how he did it. And they knew they could not do it. I don't think they all understood and comprehended as Peter did on the boat. When Jesus tells them from shore to drop the net, and they do, they're overwhelmed. He realizes that's Jesus. He's terrified. There was a recognition of who Jesus is. Maybe not a full comprehension, but a recognition that he has a power that they've never seen. What follows is interesting to me. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us." How is it that they, seeing a young man brought back to life, they'd never seen anything like this before? Your initial thought probably isn't, wow, I wonder if the one who did that was one of the old prophets that came back to life. How did they get to that? So they assumed it must have been a prophet that come back to life, and so now this prophet can do this. A prophet from a long, long time ago? I mean, it's hard enough to comprehend someone in a casket coming back to life. They assume the only way that could be possible is a prophet that's been dead for a couple thousand years now has suddenly come back to life. That's even far more out of the realm of normal for us. A great prophet has arisen among us. God has visited his people, and this report spread throughout the whole area of Judea and all the surrounding country. Yeah, I would think it didn't take long for word to get out. It didn't take long for word to get out. This is something they're going to be talking about for a very, very, very long time. But as we've stated many times, at least in terms of politics, people have a short memory, don't they? Because it was only a couple of years later, the crowds are saying, "Crucify him." He claims to be the Son of God. We don't see any evidence of that, really. Matthew chapter 11. We'll look at this for just a few moments. Pick up with this next week. Much of this portion, by the way, is recorded quite similar actually in Luke's account. Luke states that the healings of various kinds took place in the same hour that the messengers from John the Baptist were present, but Matthew gives us additional details as well. Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples. He sent them out to teach and to preach. And when John heard in prison about the deeds of Christ, said word was getting out. His word was getting everywhere. sent his disciples to Jesus to see if he was the one. Are you the one? Or do we look for someone else? This is interesting. Jesus says, go tell John what you hear and see. Well, guess what? John had already heard. He'd already heard what people have been hearing and seeing. He says, go tell them the same thing. He'd already been hearing. I want to look at Matthew's account on this because of the detail that he presents. Luke, I will bring a couple of points in from Luke because he tends to focus more on the people aspect. He notes at the end of it, end of this portion goes through verse 30. Luke notes that at the conclusion of this, some of the crowd respond favorably to Jesus' teaching. Others flat out reject it. Want nothing to do with it. Deny it. I mean, flat out deny it. How do you do that? If you are in the presence of one that had been dead and now is alive, and you know the only connection is Jesus, how would you say, there's nothing to him? He says what he says, but there's nothing there. How would you get to that? Plenty of examples in our world today. Plenty of examples of people that flat out deny the obvious.
I think it has to do with the past, okay? That happened just like the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That might have happened. The power and the intensity of it all, because people don't look to that as their salvation, but just look at life as like, this is life, and don't look at the aspect of something of that, big event to look to as their salvation. Just like, oh yeah, that happened, oh yeah, it might have happened, I don't know. I mean, we have that in our world today, the power of Jesus Christ is still present, but people in their human apathy and whatever else is in their heads forget the power of the gospel.
Are people that gullible is not even the word, but to just
Cognitive dissonance. I think it's term possible. So entrenched in our way of thinking that when another idea is presented to us, like, you're crazy.
so
because they think it. And there is no other explanation, but, and we see it all over now with CRT, the green movement, all of this is if you disagree with them, you are an evil person because they're so much smarter. We're an evolution denier because they're so much smarter. They have so much information on evolution that how can you believe in that hokey creation? And they have
So a Chinese spy balloon goes all the way across the U.S., but there's nothing to see here. People believe a lie. Readily believe a lie. Why? Well, because it's easier at times than accepting the truth. And we'll pick up that point as we continue next week, because to recognize who it is that's doing what Jesus is doing demands a right response. Demands a right response. And so it's easier to believe a lie than to respond to the truth. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the clear evidence, the testimony that you gave concerning your Son, that he is indeed God in flesh. Continue to help us set our eyes on Christ. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.